Well, this is a reproduction of a Titanic life jacket. It is not, of course, an original, but its pedigree is pretty good. It was created for the 1980 movie Raise the Titanic, so it's quite authentic. And of course, on the night of the disaster, these were stored above people's wardrobes in their rooms or in other places. Everyone was told to don their life jackets and go up to the top deck. And one of the bachelor trio, Thompson Beattie, originally from Fergus, Ontario, was last seen on the boat deck in his life preserver. And we know that he managed to make it into a submerged lifeboat called Collapsible A. And early in the morning, when the few survivors who hadn't died of hypothermia in the freezing water in lifeboat A, when they were rescued, Thompson Beattie and two crewmen, three bodies, were left in the boat, and it was simply shoved off. And the submerged lifeboat was found a month later by a ship called the Oceanic, with the three bodies still floating in it. And this life jacket had floated over the face of Thompson Beattie, and he was still wearing the evening clothes that he had worn at dinner that evening, and his hair had gone white from the salt. But he was the last body recovered and the last body buried at sea from the Titanic. And in his family's tombstone, on the family tombstone in Fergus, Ontario, there is a plaque to Thompson Beattie, who died on the RMS Titanic. Well, just to show you how there's always something new to learn about the Titanic, at my first Titanic talk for the launch of my new book, Gilded Lives, Fatal Voyage, I was in the town of Creemore giving a bookstore talk, and a neighbor of mine in the country came in with this family album and said my uncle was, or my great uncle, was on the Titanic. And one often hears these stories, so I was slightly skeptical, but then she said, oh, well, his name was Joseph Finney. And I went, oh my gosh, he's in my book. And I said, and you know, I say that it's thought that Joseph Finney was probably a gay man. He was 35, traveling with a 16-year-old barrel maker's apprentice named Joseph Gaskell. He was very active in church work with youths at his local church, and the regular visits of young boys to his home had raised the suspicion of neighbors that he was perhaps a Nancy boy. Now, I must stress, we of course don't know for certain, since it was an imprisonable offense 100 years ago, whether many of the people I talk about are actually gay. However, I think all gay history relies on some interpretation and some reading between the lines. And I think so at any rate, she opened the family album and showed me this picture of her great uncle, Joseph Finney. And I hadn't known that such a photograph existed. And I think it's easy to imagine Joseph Finney as a gay man when you look at his photograph. All right, well, we're looking at the Titanic's first-class reception room on D-Deck, which was popularly known as the Palm Room because it had potted palms and wicker chairs in the fashionable palm court style of the day. It was also where the orchestra played during tea time in the style of a palm court orchestra, and where people took drinks and sometimes their desserts after dinner. It was also the first room that people entered for those who entered at Cherbourg, because it's where the gangways came into this room, which is why it was called the reception room. And in Gilded Lives, Fatal Voyage, I begin by talking about the passengers arriving late, because the Titanic arrived late in Cherbourg. And of course, it was too big to dock there, so they had to bring a tender out to the Titanic. And of course, the gangway was swaying from the wake of the Titanic. And a woman named Mrs. Ella White, her cries were heard across the reception room. She had a bad leg anyway and was walking with a cane, and she fell on the swaying gangway and had to be assisted to her room by her slimmer younger companion, her chauffeur, and her lady's maid. Now, Ella White and her partner, Marie Young, her younger partner, Marie Young, whom seems clear to me had what was known at the time a Boston marriage. They lived together for their lives, and Mrs. White left her estate to Marie Young. But they were bringing back some prize hens for Mrs. White's Westchester estate, 2 roosters and a couple of hens, and so the sound of cocks crowing on the Titanic was this curious noise that people reported hearing. This is also the room where the Canadian trio, a Canadian middle-aged bachelor trio, known as the Three Musketeers, would take tea or have a cigar or dessert after dinner. But it would only have been two of the trio who actually spent any time here. The third member of the group, Hugo Ross from Winnipeg, had come down with dysentery in Egypt and had been taken aboard the Titanic on a stretcher and spent the whole time in his room. And on the night of the disaster, after it struck the iceberg, his friend Thompson Beattie, who was originally from Fergus, Ontario, came to his room to tell him what had happened, and Hugo Ross said, "Oh, is that all? It'll take more than an iceberg to get me out of my bed." And of course, Hugo Ross's body was never found.